welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck. Our guest author is Ron Rychlak, author of Hitler, the War, and the Pope, the second edition, published by our Sunday Visitor. Great to have you here, Ron.
Thanks, Doug. Great to be here.
You know, it's a bit of a flashback because we were together maybe 12 years ago or so when this book, the original edition, first came out, and we got to talk about this, and it's great to have you back here. And a lot of people recall that you did the series with Sister, the Fighting Nun, Sister
right.
Marchione, and of course you were on a few months back in June with Father Mucci on EWTN Live when we premiered the movie about Pope Pius XII.
That was a lot of fun. The whole process has been really a chance for me to learn and to share what I've learned. I appreciate that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, too, with a movie like that because people will notice it's been out a few years, but people really haven't seen it in the United States because quite honestly, our understanding, it's too controversial for most of the mainstream media to want to air it, okay? And that's probably why you're writing this book, in a sense, right?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, it seems silly to me that movie, of all the movies we see that are done all the time, that's considered controversial, but certainly glad EWTN made it available to all of us.
Right. Exactly. And what was your take on that film? How did you feel about it when you first saw it in relation to your knowledge of Pius XII?
There's a lot of artistic liberty that's been taken on, and it does put the Pope thinking about arguments that came up much later. So there's some incongruities with it, but it's a much better depiction than anything that's been done before.
Well, let me ask you about that too, because isn't part of the problem we're dealing with and you're responding to is that most of the attacks on Pius XII are post facto, meaning people looking back after things are resolved and now commenting on what somebody should have done 20 years before or 30 years before.
Absolutely. If you go back and you look at the headlines in the newspapers, in the mainstream press, the academic press, the Jewish press, throughout the war years, after the war years, at the time of Pius XII's death, he received praise. The New York Times said, he was a lone voice crying out of the silence of a continent. He was the one everyone thought was clearly standing against the Nazis. And it's 20 years later, it's 5 years after he died, that this whole myth of Pius XII being silent develops.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned in the book as well that it's not a coincidence that this all occurred after he died and wasn't around to defend himself, right?
That's right, and that's the thing I think is most interesting about the second edition of Hitler, the War, and the Pope. It opened up a new area for me to explore and understand and how this myth developed.
Now, you seem to be able to have had access to new material. How did you get that access?
Well, over the course of a decade or so, I've made contacts, made friends. New archives have opened. People have contacted me. I've traveled to Rome and looked at archival documents. So I've had an opportunity just to delve deeper and to find some new areas to explore that I didn't even know about when I wrote the first edition of the book.
Right, and in the foreword, Renato Cardinal Martino said, in this new edition of Hitler, the War, and the Pope, Professor Ron Rychlak once again offers a synthetic historical account of the inner dynamics of World War II and the singular role played by the Catholic Church and specifically by Pope Pius XII in rescuing untold numbers of Jewish men, women, and children from the terror of Hitler Nazi regime. The thing that always struck me with this, and having done interviews over the years with Sister and yourself and our series and looking into Pius XII is, and you deal with it kind of in the Q&A of the idea of, did anybody do more? People could sit here now and retrospectively say, so-and-so should have done more, but he did more than anyone else did. Why aren't the other people being criticized?
Well, I think because the Catholic Church has been targeted. I think he's been singled out for that reason, and I think it's particularly unfair. When I give my talks, I'll say, okay, the Allies, the American Army did more, because you had to stop the war to end the Holocaust. But no individual spoke out more frequently, urging peace, praying for an end to the war, and talking specifically about violations of human rights regularly, that everyone understood was a call to take care of the victims and the Jewish victims, among others.
Mm-hmm. And also in the foreword here, you have a Rabbi Eric A. Silver. Where do you know him from?
He's involved with Pave the Way Foundation out of New York. Wonderful man who it's an organization that tries to resolve conflicts between the groups.
Oh, great. Now, he references the 29th clause of the Magna Carta. What does that have to do with this whole thing? What does that have to do with Pius XII?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I should know that off the top. No, but it's about the situation, the relationship between people and individuals. You know, what is the role of government? And there's a big issue involved here about the role of government, not just within the Germany during the Nazi era, but in general. I think we go beyond that in this book to look at, have governments gotten too big? Have they begun to deny rights to people, to individuals? And are there things we need to look at, and are there lessons for today?
So in that way, it's very current as well.
Absolutely.
And one of the things you mentioned too, when you say, you talk about the decade that has passed since publication of the first edition, certainly the controversy over the wartime leadership of Pope Pius XII has been much hotter than it was in previous 10 years. Why would this controversy grow?
What happened was, it became evident to me. If you look at Hitler's Pope, and that's the one that ignited the controversy.
Is that Cornwall's book?
John Cornwall's book came out in 1999. You get to the last chapter of that book, and it's called Pius XII Redivivus. It says, John Paul II is Pius XII. Pius XII led us to the Holocaust. John Paul II is leading us to a very bad place. It's an argument against John Paul II, as was two later books that Cornwall wrote. All these critics of Pius XII really were looking at the next papacy. They saw the end of John Paul II coming along, and they were trying to move the Catholic Church in a new direction. We had Daniel Goldhagen, Gary Wills calling for Vatican III, calling for all kinds of changes in the church, including even excising certain passages from the New Testament. They were not accurately looking at history, they were looking at the future.
Well, it's not unusual. We know from Shakespeare and other authors, and people have written plays that, like the Andersonville trial was really written about, the Nuremberg trials, or things like that, where people use historical pieces to comment on things that are presently occurring.
And if you do that, if we take a lesson from history and use it accurately and fairly, that's fine. These guys were distorting history to try to shape the future for purely political reasons.
And for some of them also, I guess they saw what their view of the church, the post-Vatican II, their vision was slipping away under John Paul II.
Exactly.
In some ways, right?
Precisely.
Okay. Now, you also had, John Cardinal O'Connor, the late great John Cardinal O'Connor, he actually mentioned in the original first edition, you say that Pope Pius, that Pope Pius did all in his power to negotiate peace and save as many Jewish people as he could. And what was touching was that he wrote this really about, 2 months before he died, right? How did you get in touch with him?
As best I can tell, this is the second to last thing he ever wrote. And what happened was, I had my manuscript. I didn't know where to publish it, what to do with it. And I sent several people a synopsis and maybe one chapter of it, including him. And I got a very nice letter back from him and thanking me for my work and asking to see the full manuscript. So I sent him the full manuscript along with a cover letter that said, gee, if you'd like to write a foreword. And I didn't think, and then I read about his declining health. And I thought, well,
right.
At least he got to read it. And
right.
and just shortly before he died, I got a letter, and it had the foreword in there, and it was just incredible. I was so honored.
Now, in the chapter, Hitler Battles the Churches, this is interesting. I mean, a lot of people know about the Night of the Long Knives, when basically the stormtroopers were put down effectively because Hitler made a deal with the army,
right.
In before World War II. But I didn't realize that he used this opportunity to not only do that, but to rid himself of the major Catholic opposition leaders.
He did. A number of Catholic leaders who could have, stood against him, that he saw as an obstacle to his development or his power. He eliminated them as well that night.
Mm-hmm. The other thing, in chapter 16, I want to jump ahead because we've talked about a lot of the book already, but some of the new stuff, the play, The Deputy, and the KGB plot. Now, this is interesting, too, because in reading your book, it's odd in a way, because here you have National Socialism, you have the Nazis, whose arch enemies, at least ultimately during the war, were the communists and the Russians. And it seems to be that you're making the case here that it was the Stalinists, so to speak, or the Russians or the communists, who were the ones who used what happened during World War II, quote unquote, with the Nazis, and what he didn't do against him after the fact for other reasons, as you alluded to earlier, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And that's what I think is most different about this edition of Hitler, the War and the Pope, as opposed to the first edition. Right. There's an important component, and it developed like, it started like this. The hardest question, I give talks all over America, and the hardest question I ever got was in Oklahoma. It was a priest raised his hand after my talk, said, "Professor, I believe everything you say, but if everything you say is true, why do so many people think Pius XII is a bad guy?" And I gave the traditional answer, which, well, there was this play called The Deputy, and that just made people think differently about it. But that's very unsatisfying. How can a play by itself really do that? Then in 2007, Ian Mihai Pacepa, the former #2 guy in Romania, wrote an article in National Review Online and said, this play, The Deputy, that was all part of a plot that I was involved in to discredit Pope Pius XII. That wasn't just something that came up. We developed that. We cultivated that.
And you ultimately wrote a book with him, right?
Wrote a book with him
a little bit
after
about
that,
it at the end of the show, right? Okay.
But that's what this chapter is, taking his story and developing that. And because when I plugged that in, every little piece of evidence seemed to make things that I didn't understand before make sense now.
Now, in this, and this is the thing that I think all of Pope Pius XII's reputation flipped so fully and so fast without any new evidence being uncovered. Indeed, solely on the basis of activity or inactivity that had been fully known for almost 2 decades. So there wasn't anything new. Suddenly, everything flipped over. And also, you mentioned this. I'm wondering, was it a coincidence? You said the Deputy opened in Berlin in '63, which coincided with the Second Vatican Council and the publication of Anne Frank's diary and the execution of Adolf Eichmann. You think that all played together, at least the last 2?
That was my original answer. That was the original understanding of how the Deputy made sense. Before when you add Soviet bloc disinformation coming in to support it, it makes a whole lot more sense. Those were all things that those of us who studied Pius XII had cobbled together to try to understand how, with no new evidence, the reputation flips. It wasn't fully satisfying when you realize there was Soviet bloc disinformation as well. Now it makes a whole lot more sense.
Now let's go through some of the things you point out. You talk about Soviet leaders opposed the church, took actions against it. One of the things you say is the Deputy certainly draws upon communist propaganda from the 1940s. What do you mean?
Well, at the end of World War II, communist influence has now spread dramatically. It also, in 1948, communism almost took over Italy. Pius XII fought very hard to keep communism from coming into power in Italy. And the communists recognized this, and they actively promoted some ideas of Pius XII's sympathies to Nazism. They did this, by the way, in Poland with Cardinal Wyszynski, in Hungary with Mindszenty, in Croatia with Stepanak. This was their technique. You associate the Catholic leader with the former Nazi leadership, and you discredit him that way. They tried to do that with Pius XII. It did not succeed in 1948. 1963, they tried again with a slightly different technique. The Pope's now dead. They have a play. The play, you can point, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong.
And it's a fictional play.
It's fictional play. And so when you point out all the things that are wrong, people say, well, of course,
it's a poetic license, right?
Yeah, exactly, poetic license. But really, fundamentally, it's true, is the argument.
Right. You also point out that the German and American producers of the play, the American publisher, and the French translator were all communists. And this one I thought was interesting. You say the play would not have opened on Broadway, but support from a Catholic magazine that was falling under communist influence at the time. What magazine was that?
Ramparts. Fascinating story about that. Ramparts magazine is coming out of San Francisco. It's founded by a guy named Keating in about 1962, late 62. In 63, the play opens in Berlin. 64, it's getting ready to open on Broadway. This little magazine spends an enormous amount of money, rents out the Waldorf Astoria, has catered press receptions with people from all over there supporting it, spends an amount of money that you cannot legitimately justify. The magazine could not have justified, but enormous amount of money ultimately helps the play, come and be produced. That same magazine, within 2 years, is being investigated by the CIA because it was being funded by foreign sources.
And how do you pronounce the author's name, actually, of the deputy?
Hokuth.
Hokuth.
I say Hokuth, but
Okay.
I say it like an American.
And you said that he worked closely after the deputy with a friend of his who was known as basically a Holocaust denier.
His lifelong friend is David Irving. David Irving, after Ahmadinejad, the I guess now former president of Iran, David Irving is probably the world's foremost Holocaust denier. Ralph Hokuth, who's considered a liberal man of the left, is best friends with a guy who's actually been imprisoned in Europe for Holocaust denial. And they've defended one another throughout the process. And in fact, when this accusation came out that the Soviets were behind the play of the deputy, the first person to defend Hokuth was David Irving.
Now, did he also write then this play called Soldiers?
Right.
Which was designed to basically attack Winston Churchill and the bombing of the German cities during World War II?
The next play after the deputy was called Soldiers, and it accused Winston Churchill not just of the bombing, but in fact of assassinating a Polish leader along with 16 other people. Huge controversy in England at the time. Became sort of a cause because it looked like the government was interfering with free speech. But Hokuth was totally unmasked on David Frost's television show. People who he said had died and participated were alive and brought on stage, and he actually had to pay a significant judgment in court for the lies he'd told.
Right. Now, you had alluded to some of the names before. In Chapter 17, you kind of lay out the various critics, all of which, most of which you mentioned before. And one of the things that we have heard before kind of in there, because they're very big on John the 23rd, because they pour into him anything they want to pour into his belief system. And they kind of say, well, he did a great job during the war. The Pope should have done more like he did. And it says here, throughout his life, John praised Pius. Before he was made Pope, John offered thanks for his wartime efforts to save Jewish refugees. He replied, in all these painful matters, I referred to the Holy See and simply carried out Pius XII's orders, first and foremost to save human lives. And you even say that he considered taking Pius XIII as possibly his name when he became Pope.
He did. You know, people tried to separate these two men, and they're not. It's not like a night and day thing. They're different men, of course, but. John the 23rd, like Paul VI. In 1955, the Israeli Philharmonic came to Rome and played a concert of tribute to thank the Catholic Church for all that had been done to save Jews. They posed for a photograph with Pope Pius XII. They offered Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, a medal for all he had done to save Jews. He declined it, saying, all I did was carry out the Pope's orders. Nobody deserves a medal for that.
Right, right. It's interesting. I mean, what do you say to somebody, or what does somebody say when you say, well, all of these things happened before? Do they just assume, well, the people back then didn't have all the information we have today, so they were duped by the Pope?
See, I mean,
you did a good job or something? Or?
You could make that argument if there was something new we discovered. There's nothing new we discovered. So, I mean, that doesn't make sense. One of the things they'll say that I think is actually offensive in some ways. They'll say, well, Jewish leaders did it back then to try to cultivate goodwill with the Vatican, with the Catholic Church, because the newly established state of Israel was still, needed friends. So they basically lied for political reasons, which I find offensive.
Well, I would think it's offensive to them as well. Now, we talked about, was it Cornwall? Now, he came out with a new edition as well back in 2008, where he seems like he at least toned down some of his accusations.
Well, it's sort of funny because he toned down some of his accusations right before his second edition came out. He said, in light of the arguments and evidence that has come forth since my first edition, I recognize that the Pope had very limited options and couldn't really do very much after all. But then the second edition came out with virtually no changes. And since then, he's sort of reasserted his old line as well. So it's, he kind of tries to have it both ways.
Right. And you have a whole section in here, very helpful, chapter 18, where you just really deal with all the exact questions. Was the Pope anti-Semitic? And did he know about the final solution? And was the Pope blinded by his hatred of communism? All the different things that we've heard over the years. One of the things, just quick with the Cornwall book, before we move on to your other book called Disinformation, is the picture, the famous picture we always see. And you say, making matters worse, and the caption from inside the dust cover on the early British editions of the book labels the photograph as having been taken in March 1939, which of course people say, well, Hitler was in power, it was right before the war. And it turns out that that picture was taken, what, in 1927?
1927, right.
When it was still the Weimar Republic.
Yeah, he was leaving a birthday party for President Hindenburg.
Right. Right. People realize that Germans' uniforms were very similar between World War I and World War II as far as the regular soldier.
Exactly. But the critics love that picture because it looks like you've got the Pope surrounded by Nazi soldiers. Really, you've got the papal representative surrounded by Weimar soldiers.
Well, do you think a lot of the problem you have here is also the idea of they splash the negative headlines on the front pages and the retractions are on the back page, very small. So whatever is done later, the vast majority of people who don't spend a lot of time, who deal in a world like we do, where it's kind of images. We get in our mind an image of what things are and aren't, and then we go with that. And we don't really think that deeply about it.
Well, that's precisely correct. If you get a retraction, you don't always get a retraction. But you know, when I do my talks for that reason, I like to do PowerPoint slideshows and show them the headlines and show them the doctored photographs and show people, you know, the evidence so they can see it with their own eyes. And I think it's just amazing.
Now you have another book here, which you wrote with the Romanian
Pacepa.
Pacepa, Disinformation, and you talk about this, and it's a little different book, doesn't quite fit into everything we would probably do, but there's some stuff in here about what was done to, you know, Cardinal Mazzenti and Stepanak, and also the whole idea with disinformation with the Vatican. The other thing you talk about here is, and I know Stalin used to do, he used to erase people out of photographs all the time, and you talk about how Khrushchev did that too. They would rewrite history. It's like watching 1984, where they're changing the newspapers.
Absolutely, and if you look at the leaders of whether it's Russia or the Soviet Union, virtually each new leader goes back and rewrites history so that the previous leader was not as great as people thought he was, and that he was greater than people thought they were, and they're continually doing that.
Or these people like Trotsky, he was in, and it's this famous picture of all of them there with Lenin, and suddenly one by one they all disappear,
Yeah.
and it's just like Stalin and him. That's about
Exactly,
it.
yeah.
You know, now you say here you talk about Stalin's encounter with Catholicism. Now we always hear, well, Stalin, wasn't he studying to be a priest or something for the Orthodox Church at one time?
Well, you know, at some point in everyone's life, they may have thought something like that. But no, Stalin was not at any point a serious candidate, I think, to be a priest.
Now, he talks about the fact that you point out here, that when Stalin and Hitler had the pact, okay, which basically divvied up Poland and the other, some of the areas that he was taking over were the Baltic states. There were a lot of Catholic churches, and he really worked to say that Stalin's image in the country as Little Father, whereas the Tsar had been called, apparently, he wasn't big on having people have another father, right?
Right. Well, and see, and that's the thing that you know, as the Soviet sphere, you know, increased in its influence, they first want to sidle up to the Catholic Church and have the people follow them. They don't want them following the Pope, though.
Right.
And so first you kind of get the support, and then you sever ties.
Right. So Stalin destroyed the Orthodox Church, and then he really just tried to destroy the church inside any land that he ultimately
And he just
controlled,
about
right?
did. I mean, pretty much did.
And I'm not sure, because I would, you know, in the parts that I actually was able to get through, you know, we've heard for years also that there was a fair amount of infiltration that went on, in seminaries and things like that.
Yeah, and that actually is one of the things, as I began researching this, I was amazed to see how much there was. I mean, they literally got young men and sent them to Rome or sent them to seminary, or they would recruit people who were in seminary through blackmail or whatever and get them to become informers. There was the big scandal in Poland a few years ago where they found out that so many Polish priests had been corrupted by the Soviet regime. The Soviet regime, throughout its existence, recognized that the Catholic Church was an arch enemy. And so whatever it took, they approached the Catholic Church the way they would approach the United States, for instance. If they could get spies, whatever they get, that's what they wanted.
Right, and I think sometimes even that impacted, I think I've read with some opinions, that when certain things came up or charges came against bishops or priests, John Paul II was a little slow to believe them because he had come out of a world where that was a standard tactic. as you indicated earlier, to be used against the church.
That's exactly right. He'd heard these kind of accusations before, and they'd been false before.
Right. Now, what was, in going through this as it relates to the church, what was the most interesting thing you found out?
Well, I think the infiltration was amazing. But in terms of the church, I guess I'd also say that the way that they developed this play, the way, to bring the deputy to Broadway, it started by finding a guy working on a play that was not about the Pope, but basically running it through a committee, and you come out with this monstrous 8-hour-long production that no one could produce. They get Erwin Piscator, a really brilliant man in theatrical history, but a man who, from his earliest days, took orders from the Communist Party and produced plays for the Communist Party. They put him in a theater which they constructed specifically to do communist propaganda. This is the first play he produces. He cuts it down from 8 hours to 2 hours, makes it manageable. Right. It was a fascinating, just the little pieces as they all fall into place.
One thing before we go, in chapter 35, From Hitler's Pope to September 11th, with the framing of Pius XII as Hitler's Pope, the Kremlin began to make anti-Semitism an international movement. That doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, here you have the Pope's being accused of anti-Semitism, and that's bad, but somehow they're using that to proffer anti-Semitism.
Well, what they did in the Soviet Union was they fomented anti-Semitism in the Middle East. They tried to convince Middle Eastern nations, except for Israel, that that the United States Congress, with support by supporting Israel, is trying to create a Jewish state, not only a Jewish state, but really to spread Judaism and create a stronger area. They realized if they could convince the Arab nations to turn not just against Israel, but also against the United States, you could have surrogates carrying out the war for them.
Right, and of course, because of the British occupation there, many of the Arabs were on the Nazi side during World War II.
They were, absolutely.
Okay, we're just out of time. Good luck with disinformation. Thank you so much, Ron, and good luck with Hitler, the war, and the Pope. Okay?
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it very much.
Stop by next time. Speaking here with Ron Rychlak, author of Hitler, the War, and the Pope. Now, this is the second edition. Check it out. It's published by OSV, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Thanks so much for being with us.